welcome to Talking Pictures. It's the end of July. I'm Mary Stack.
And I'm Michael Dow.
And we're going to talk you through some of the latest things we've been viewing. And we're going to cover Pavarotti.
And Echo in the Canyon.
And then Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, The Farewell.
And The Great Hack.
So, let's kick off with Luciano Pavarotti. So I've always had a kind of love-hate relationship with Pavarotti. He had this immense ego, and I thought he was kind of unlikable and boastful. And I have to say, this film changed my mind about that. It does a pretty decent job of explaining his sort of lowly background and his multiple love affairs and his immense appetite for living and food, which is part of his downfall, I think, the food. And lots of unusual and diverse people are drawn to him because of this sort of larger-than-life personality and talent. There's a clip where Bono says, you know, he just turned up at my house in Dublin. And apparently he said, we've got to do this song for the Bosnian children, right there on the doorstep, and they did. He said he had this incredible drawl and that great smile. And in the latter part of his life, he used that to good end because he raised a lot of money for charities, largely influenced by Princess Diana, who he liked very much, they had a great friendship. So she got him to do concerts for children, what have you. So I think his greatest achievement probably was taking opera to the masses.
Right.
And, you know, in fact, he got Puccini in the top 10, you know, for weeks on end, when the three tenors did that concert. So that was an amazing achievement, and I think he did have a very big voice, but he had a very big heart, and that was something I didn't really understand or appreciate till I saw the film. So worth seeing.
Okay. My take on that too is, you know, I was always kind of skeptical about the idea of bringing opera to the masses. You know, but then again, you realize that's really where it belongs, right? He kind of made it accessible again, which is really, as far as I understand opera, that's really the point of it, you know, is to make it accessible. Did the film get into any kind of critical analysis of that influence, or?
No, it's pretty much
celebratory.
Yeah. So I think they did a decent job. You know, there's some documentary interviews with the children talking about how he was never around.
Yep, negligent.
And that upset him, and he was aware of that deficit.
Yeah. And I know it's a Ron Howard documentary. I wasn't too thrilled with his Beatles live documentary. Does this one kind of paint a rosy picture, or does it kind of give you more of a sense of the full picture of who he was,
full picture.
warts and all?
I think you get an idea of the things that he felt disappointed about in his life, and he really did have insecurities. One can never believe that. That was why he had that handkerchief.
Okay.
He said, what am I going to do with my hands at that concert when he wasn't in an opera role on stage and he was doing a concert? He said, what am I going to do with my hands? And they said, pull your handkerchief out. And so that became his kind of big thing.
Security blanket almost.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So it was kind of
Did he have stage fright then? Or
he was always critical of his performance.
Yeah.
He was always hypercritical. No, it was never good enough.
Yeah. The great ones always seem to be the most and analytical, oftentimes in a negative way. Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah, interesting. And moving to another film, very different end of the music industry now, Echo in the Canyon. This is a documentary about those halcyon days of music making and free love in Laurel Canyon in the 60s.
Yep, basically mid-60s. It really limits its focus to about a year or two.
Yeah.
66, 67.
And it's anchored by Jacob Dylan, who we just had talked about his father's documentary in the last episode, Rolling Thunder Review. So he's carrying the torch. And it's kind of a quirky little film. There's lots of good interviews, I felt, by people who are still alive and can remember that period. I think probably Stephen Stills is on the fence in that category.
Yeah.
But you know, I learned quite a lot. I learned about how important the Byrds were, how pivotal they were in taking folk and fusing it into rock.
Yeah,
I wasn't
exactly.
fully aware of that. So that was very educational, really. And then also the conversations with Tom Petty. I thought Tom Petty was a real stalwart interview in this. I really enjoyed the things he had to say about music and about how Brian Wilson impacted composition and production and he put him on a par with Bach,
Yeah,
and said, you know, these people,
revolutionized.
come
Yeah.
along once in a century, which I thought was an amazing tribute to the man. So that was interesting, and also about how Pet Sounds, that album,
Is the pivotal album.
yeah, and it
Yeah.
affected the Beatles. How many
Yes.
people can say that? They
Yeah.
went away and did Sgt. Pepper's upon hearing that.
Yeah, exactly.
Scuffled
Well,
off.
again, yeah, the documentary does a reasonable job at contextualizing the influences that then fed the kind of Laurel Canyon sound. You know, the Beatles and the way the Beatles kind of incorporated folk and electrified it, which then influenced Dylan, and you know, on and on. And likewise, how there was the camaraderie and competition in America and Britain, mainly between Brian Wilson and the Beatles. I mean, it's not history that I was unfamiliar with before I saw it, so I guess it's reasonably informative for an audience. It seemed to me the film, I mean, I'll get to the things I really liked about it, because there are a lot of things I liked about it, but it seemed to prioritize the kind of nostalgic, wistful effect over any real sense of really kind of getting into the analytical aspects of, you know, the sound or production value. I mean, it's nice to pay homage to someone like a Brian Wilson or Roger McGuinn, but I really, just for me, I wanted to get in the studio and really find out, okay, how did, for example, Brian Wilson revolutionize the sound of music in the studio? How did he turn the studio into its own kind of instrument? And
Well, he used 4. They said he went to 4 different ones.
yeah, exactly.
That-
Well,
that
and
was
that was one of
amazing.
the moments they review all the major studios in the LA area, but they don't really go into in this, you know, okay, how did they produce this sound here, that sound there? I wanted so much more of that. And it seemed to be more of a kind of, you know, down memory lane kind of film.
Well, it was skidding along and skating on those things. It didn't get in depth
Yeah,
in those.
yeah,
Maybe because
exactly.
it thought it might lose the audience if it got too technical.
Yeah, probably.
I
Yeah,
think possibly
yeah,
that
and
was it.
and it's only 80 minutes. Had they maybe expanded it by 20 minutes, they could have gone a little deeper into that.
But you know, I thought it was long as it was.
Really?
That
Did
was
you?
my one
Okay.
critique. It
Yeah.
was a little bit.
Well, there are too many kind of meandering interviews. There's way
Tedious.
too much time spent on Michelle Phillips. You know,
Yeah.
Michelle Phillips is still this kind of unrepentant kind of, you know, the vanity just kind of oozes off the screen with her, and she doesn't have much to say.
And looking
Still's
at guitars.
Yeah, exactly. Too much Stephen Stills not enough. David Crosby, I thought, was very, as usual, very honest and plain
Yeah, he
spoken
was.
about, you know.
And so was Graham Nash. Graham Nash was.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, you know, some of the interviews were good.
But there was no Neil Young.
No,
Which I
well,
thought
see,
was
well, Neil Young
really-
appears at the very end, recording in the studio. But
yeah.
I think he wisely avoided being interviewed. But there are a couple of things, and I think you mentioned this too, that it kind of reinvigorated my interest in the Byrds. Again, understanding why they're so important, because I think they are one of those bands, a little bit like the Kinks. They kind of get buried under,
You're right.
you know, the kind of shadow of
Not fully
bigger.
appreciated.
Exactly.
Yeah,
So the
yeah.
Roger McGuinn interview I thought was really good, and that came very early in the film and kind of evaporates. The bit with Tom Petty, of course, was bittersweet. I'm a massive, entirely biased fan of Tom Petty, so I was kind of like, yeah, and he kind of disappears about halfway into the movie, but he, at the same time, has some of the more clever observations, I think, in the film. I thought the biggest deficit, well, there are a couple of them, really, are those moments where we focus on Jakob Dylan kind of performing, not kind of, but they perform the songs, many of those songs live on stage. So you'll go from a kind of archived performance of the Byrds, and then we'll cut to Jakob Dylan performing on stage, and the energy level just falls through the floor.
Plus, they don't have it. I mean, we all went with the hope of seeing all those people we loved doing their songs.
Yeah,
And then we were kind
with
of
a kind of
snatched
energy.
away.
And there's so many strange shots. I'm also a big Beck fan, and he features prominently in the film, and he is involved in the live performance. But there's a moment, I hate to nitpick one little moment, but there's a moment where they're performing a Mamas and the Papas song, and it looked to me like Beck didn't know the words, and so he's kind of like miming words. It was really strange. There are so many things in the film. It's like, why is that in there? Why is it in there? One other moment too, or one other motif throughout the film, is when you've got Cat Power, Regina Spektor, Beck, and Jakob Dylan sitting around a couch and talking about all the great albums of the time, but they don't say anything. It's like you don't really get any. There's no real takeaway from it. It's like, okay, give me a new way to think about this music, and you don't really get that.
I don't think they really understood that significant period. I think Jacob perhaps did
And
because
Beck,
of his
I
dad.
think. Beck too, but Beck's not, he
was
doesn't have much
immersed in
camera
it.
presence, yeah.
Anyway, it's worth seeing. I think music buffs will like
Yeah,
this
it's
flick.
neither here nor there, but if you
Yeah.
don't know much
It's
about that
pleasant
scene,
and you'll learn something.
Yeah.
And it's fun. Some of it's fun.
yeah, reasonably.
Yeah. Okay, so we have to get this over with, Mike.
Yeah, I have to kind of brace ourselves.
Okay, the latest wasteful extravaganza from Quentin Tarantino, which I think was only a mere $100 million frittered away, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is very difficult for me to talk about. I could not find anything redeeming about this film. It was an exercise, a very magnificent exercise in futility.
And a kind of onanistic self-indulgence.
Unbelievable self-indulgence. I don't even want to, I could get very graphic, but I'm not going to. Despite having this star-studded cast, it has almost no plot line. It meanders around. It gives us these long, laborious drives. There's lots of nice 60s vintage cars. There's tons of cigarettes being lit. I think I stopped counting at 50. There's feet. He's got a thing about feet, and he hates women. Quentin Tarantino actually hates women. I didn't realize.
Yeah, at first I thought, well, it's like he doesn't really know how to direct women. And with one or two exceptions, Jennifer Jason Leigh in The Hateful Eight, great performance. There are some, great Jackie Brown, Pam Grier. There are some great female performances in his movies. It's not to say that they aren't there.
But look at Sharon Tate in this, Margot Robbins. She doesn't have anything to say. She's a mute.
Yeah, my attempt to be neutral about it is that he just doesn't know how to direct them. But it actually does really feel like, and I'm not one of these people who is in any way, shape, or form easily offended, but it just seemed like there was this rampant misogyny in this movie that's ramped up in a way that I have not seen in his other films.
All the women. I'm trying to think of the women. There was this strident, militant, quasi, she didn't have a whip, but she had boots, director, who strides on the set. Mm-hmm. There was this precocious,
child star.
Abnormal child star who was the most adult, which was very scary, of all the women. And there was this tribe of zombies and hookers.
Yeah, the Manson girls. Yeah,
and Sharon Tate.
And there's this kind of hippie girl who's in the Manson cult who keeps trying to seduce Brad Pitt's character. We should mention briefly what the film is about.
Yes, what is it about?
It mainly focuses on three characters. There's Rick Dalton, Leonardo DiCaprio's character, who's kind of a washed-up Western movie TV star. Yeah. Then there's Cliff Booth, the character played by Brad Pitt, who is his stunt double, but he becomes his caretaker. Yeah. And then there's Margot Robbie's version of Sharon Tate. Mm-hmm. And because you already mentioned the Sharon Tate business, and we can maybe talk about the kind of negative implications of making the Booth character and the Dalton characters heroes at the end of the movie. I'm not big on avoiding spoiler alerts. I think maybe we should probably with this movie, but I don't think it's difficult for people to assume that the two white male leads become the heroes at the end of the film. And there are so many problematic elements in this film in relation to that and otherwise. For example, the Cliff Booth character, we're told a couple of times in the film that he may or may not have murdered his wife. We never learn anything about it.
But he beats up Bruce Lee, the fake Bruce Lee character.
Yeah, and he also is, again, not to give too much away, but he exhibits extraordinary violence towards female characters, admittedly with a certain degree of reasoning. I'm not saying he doesn't have his reasons, but it is excruciatingly violent towards women. And as I say, so what are we supposed to do with this character? Are we supposed to accept him as the hero and forget the information we've been given about his dark past? I mean, it makes no sense. It's completely undigested, as with so much of the film. And for that matter, the Sharon Tate character, as you were mentioning, the film, Tarantino has talked about how she's the emblem of the movie. She's the angel in the film. She signifies the death of the innocence of the 60s. Blah, 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 pretentious
with the dark
nonsense.
Black feet.
All I got from the film was that he gives into the worst tendencies of people's assumptions about Sharon Tate, that she was vain and stupid. That's all we learn about her in the whole film, and the film completely sells her out at the end, I feel. And again, I can't say too much
about
about...
Even that trip to the bookstore, she's picking up a copy of Thomas Hardy's Tess
of the D'Urbervilles,
which is the next film Roman Polanski makes.
Right, exactly. Well, there's, and again, it's a bit of a history there because that was her favorite book, and that she had encouraged Polanski to adapt the film, which he did later on into a phenomenal movie. But yeah, so little moments like that, if you know the incidental details, let's say, of the relationship with Polanski and Tate or the Manson murders, you come to realize that the research Tarantino seemed to do was like Wikipedia level. It's very superficial. He supposedly took 5 years to write this thing. I'm like, it feels like somebody scribbled it on the back of a napkin. That's what it felt to me. And so much of it.
It's so long.
It's ridiculously long. The ending has this allegedly subversive ending that reverses and undermines everything you've seen during the first 2.5 hours of the movie. And the ending is, of course, the requisite revenge fantasy bloodbath that we get in
Like
every
Apocalypse
Tarantino movie
Now.
But the problem is even the ending, I mean, because where I always start with it, I'm like, okay, how is it stylistically? The ending of the movie is badly shot, the makeup, the wigs, terrible. It's badly edited, it's badly staged. I don't understand.
Badly conceived.
Yeah, and as I say, I would love to get a valid counterpoint to everything I reacted to in the movie, but it just feels like, there are going to be all these Tarantino apologists, going out of the way to make a case for this movie. You can defend *Inglourious Bastards*, his other revenge movies.
Well, that was at least funny.
Yeah, of course you can make fun of Nazis, but, to kind of take the Manson murders and turn it into a big cartoon, that, I don't know. It's really...
that's the thing
like
I had most
punking
problems
a tragedy,
with. Exactly, because they start off, if you remember, with that black and white clip that's meant to be the Nazis at the beginning, and this guy going in, Rick Dalton's going in with his fire flame,
where he incinerates a group of Nazis.
And he incinerates a group of Nazis at the beginning. So there's this kind of orgy of violence. And then that's real, because we know the Nazis happened, right? So there's a quasi-documentary aspect to that, except there's this dashing character, the spy, whatever he's playing in the back, good triumphing over evil.
Right.
Then we do a complete reversal of that, because he's got the flamethrower at the end, torching the woman in the, don't want to tell everybody, but I'm like, hang on a minute. This woman really did die. This Sharon Tate did die. She was pregnant, and it was heinous, that murder. Yeah. And helter-skelter and blood all over the house. And
to kind of
fuse this into some kind of
but to
cartoon.
recreate it and recontextualize it as a fairy tale
Yes.
is ludicrous.
Yeah.
Tarantino doesn't even seem to understand the function of the fairy tale as an archetypal pattern. He seems to be just completely at odds with the very material he is producing. It's so strange.
It's very strange. But
and never mind the fact, but the title of the movie is just a big excuse for the ending. It's this elaborate excuse, and it made no sense to me at all.
No sense. And then I think what really troubled me most was, apart from it being as awful as it is and getting all these glowing reviews about how tender it is, his finest work. I mean, I think these people are all toking the acid cigarettes Brad's on in the film. Yeah. But the end, the audience are like trained seals cheering.
Yeah, and the audience
That's
also...
scary.
And it's one of the rare times where I was watching a movie where I actually felt uncomfortable at people's reaction. And it makes it, if you actually criticize Tarantino, it kind of makes you appear like you're a reactionary of some kind in some weird way. I'm like, no, this film, the politics are so regressively conservative. The two main characters are these like hippie-hating has-beens. And yet, as I say again, they are like the moral. They become the moral center of the film.
Yeah, almost right wing.
Yeah, it's incredibly right wing. Yeah, I can't. And what's worse, what I really can't stand about Tarantino above all is, like he always says, don't read into my movies. They're all about style. They're all about sensual impact and blah blah blah. It's like, no, you can't get away with that. You're making, you're producing a kind of cultural artifact that is really like, right now at the center of popular culture. You are a role model. You have a responsibility to your audience, no matter what you think, you can get away with in terms of claims or denial. No, of course people are going to read into this, and of course they're going to derive meaning from it. And for me, he's a profoundly irresponsible filmmaker for the impact he's having on an influential audience.
Very. So Once Upon a Time, the end.
Oh, really? I thought we just got warmed up.
Don't see it. Please do anything but. Go for a walk, anything. Go for a swim.
Yeah. Read Helter Skelter.
Yeah.
Go back and watch the old TV movie, which is really good.
Yeah, Helter Skelter.
Even, 40 years later.
All right, something really delightful now. Go see The Farewell. Charming, amusing, moving little Chinese film by a new young director called Lulu Wang. And Awkwafina, who is the character in Crazy Rich Asians, is the main lead, and she's very good.
In Ocean's 8 too. She was great. She kind of steals that movie.
Yeah. So she does a great job as this Brooklynite that returns to China because her grandmother is dying of cancer, but her grandmother doesn't know this. So they make this kind of ruse of a wedding to cover for this. So it's got a lot of humor. It's nicely shot. The music's good. It's actually got everything tender and authentic about it that the previous movie lacked, which I'm not going to name again. So it's a bit of a cultural gift, I feel, and I think you should go and enjoy it. Gives you hope in all sorts of things, going to see a film like that.
In human relations.
Human relations,
All right.
yeah, possibility.
Excellent.
All right,
Well, so much for the positive.
Yeah, and what about you, Mike? You watched something on Netflix.
My final choice for the week is a documentary called The Great Hack, which is a 2019 documentary, primarily focusing on the influence of Cambridge Analytica, the data company that basically engaged in the data mining of the public through social media, both here and in Great Britain primarily. And it goes into detail in terms of how data mining was used, in effect, to persuade the masses into, or not even the masses, just a sliver of a minority of the masses, just enough to basically sway both the Trump election, 2016, and then also how the extent, especially the extent to which it influenced the Leave EU, Brexit movement.
Right.
Yep, and how disturbingly effective it all was. It focuses on a couple of people, one of whom, a guy named Chris Wiley, who was an employee for Cambridge Analytica. He was the original whistleblower. Right. But it gets into this case especially of a woman named Brittany Kaiser, who was much higher up at Cambridge Analytica, someone I was never really familiar with. And she is really, to call her a whistleblower isn't really doing her justice. She was the one who very much was the kind of case study, a person who basically really exposed the inner workings of Cambridge Analytica. Again, Alexander Nix, Steve Bannon, these names should be hopefully familiar to people, Steve Bannon at least, but Alexander Nix is like, God, Machiavellian as the CEO of Cambridge Analytica. And it just really gets into the extent to which we are being thoroughly and altogether subconsciously manipulated. And the major takeaway from the movie, I think, is to really consider the way big data is the #1 global industry at work right now. We don't think about this. We think about big pharma, big agri, but it's really big data. And because it took me a while, and I think people still have a hard time kind of wrapping their minds around, okay, how is it that we are now the commodity, that human beings, our very identities, our privacy or lack thereof, our tastes, our lifestyles, all of those things are now being bought and sold as
and
commodities.
predictors of those behaviors.
Absolutely.
For the first time in history.
Absolutely, and they have a term in the film. It was an actual term used by employees at Cambridge Analytica, referring to those, let's say, the percentage of the masses who are what they call persuaders or persuadables, right? You know, which just gets back to like older kind of social theories about hidden persuasion in advertising and such. But it's now at a whole new 21st century level, and it is extraordinarily disturbing. I walked away from it. I hate to sound so negative, but it really feels like we're entering into a kind of post-democratic era. Because you've got to imagine, you've got to imagine nowadays with what's happening, certainly with the US Senate, and that there really isn't any legislation that's coming up or certainly being even considered or debated, let alone passed, that is in some way going to kind of stem the tide of kind of data manipulation.
And by the way, just while you're mentioning that, if anybody's really interested in this and doubts the facts that Michael's referring to, you should read a book called Surveillance Capitalism. Amazing, written by a Harvard economist who I heard speak. And she reels back and shows you how this situation developed.
The origins.
And she mentions the fact that this is the first time people's anticipated behavior is being traded. It's actually a commodity. And so they're shaping it. Of course they're shaping it because it's...
every single thing you do on the internet is being tracked. You know, it's one of those things.
And you're being herded into things.
You're
being herded into decisions and products.
Exactly. And
people need to be aware of that.
And again, it's one of those things where it's just like, it's another one of those moments in contemporary culture where it's like everybody knows Facebook is evil, whether or not they know exactly why or the ins and the outs of it. And yet very few of us, myself included, I mean, we're still on there. We still do it. It's as if we can't get outside of the matrix anymore.
There was an article yesterday in the BBC saying that it's time that Mark Zuckerberg was treated as a publisher, and then he would have to be responsible for what's out there. If they could do that, the laws would start to, you could impact the laws and start to bring down sites. if he was going to take responsibility as a
Oh no,
publisher.
and the film gets into that to a considerable extent. It reviews his testimony, his congressional testimony, and how
he didn't even
basically
show up to the one in Europe.
yeah, and basically how he just doesn't take responsibility for any of it.
Didn't show up.
No, they're just Facebook is just a vessel for free speech.
Empty vessel.
Yeah, totally.
Yes.
So well
Wow.
worth, I mean, it's a real dreary experience, but it's well worth looking at if you really want the kind of if you really want an expose as to how exactly we are at least potentially being manipulated. It is basically the 21st century version of the kind of propaganda that we are all too familiar with, let's say with the rise of the Third Reich and that kind of thing. So my takeaway is, this is just the beginning. What's going to be the next evolution of this if we don't stop it, Being vigilant isn't enough. We need to actually legislatively stop it,
Well, just in case people think that we're exaggerating, a friend of mine just was telling me this incident only last week. He has been living in China for 30 years, and the Chinese are completely monitored by their phones. Everything is in their phone, everything, as many of our things are. But he was standing talking to somebody, and the guy got a text, and he said, "Look at this text," and it was a picture of him jaywalking across an intersection and a notification that the penalty, the fine, had already been deducted from his bank account.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's scary.
Yeah, that you're being mapped.
That is scary. You're just a commodity.
Yeah.
You're a commodity that's being used,
Exploited.
mapped, and
Harvested.
Harvested,
I think, is the ideal metaphor.
Whoa, heavy stuff.
Yeah.
Right. What happened to the young and carefree people
I'm not
that we used to
exactly
be?
sure. Yeah.
Gosh. All right. Well, go see The Farewell. It's fun. And
Otherwise.
And there are good films coming along.
Yeah.
Okay?
We promise.
Yes. Well, on that high note, I guess it's goodbye from this episode of Talking Pictures. I'm Mary Stack.
I'm Michael Dow.
And we'll catch you with some better news in August.